We are officially at the halfway point, 45 days down, 45 days yet to come. I want to make a special thank you to Sheridan and Charles. They've led this effort for the chamber and the business community since day one and have put in some really long days, particularly as we got into the final couple of weeks of the first 45 days. I've been really fortunate to have Sheridan and Charles leading this. I cannot stress enough the amount of work that you will never know about that these two put in on behalf of the business community. A lot of things that you will never know about that would have haunted you otherwise have disappeared. And so big compliments to Charles and Sheridan for great work that they've done here. So I'm going to kind of kick us off here a little bit, and then I'll turn it over to Charles and Sheridan. This is just a first half recap so that you get an idea of the sort of flurry of activity that we've seen since the beginning of this legislative session. There were about 4,400 bills that were draft requests in, and this is pretty typical as far as the number of draft requests versus how many bills that actually get introduced. And so you see a lot of legislators that will put in sort of bill requests. It's largely a title, and they keep that as a placeholder in case somebody has a bright idea that comes up at some point early on in the legislative session. Ultimately, we actually saw 1,400 bills that were introduced, which is a lot of bills. That's not comprehensive of all the bills that are yet to be introduced, because bills that have a revenue component to them, like a tax piece to it, right? There'll be a handful of those will still be introduced. And so that number will go up, albeit it won't go up a big amount, but that number will go up a little before we completely conclude this legislative session. The transmitted bills, 698, that represents the bills that passed one chamber and passed over to the other chamber. And so that's a pretty healthy number. And 35 bills have been signed into law. A lot of the more meaty bills, I would say, are yet to be signed into law or have yet to be passed in their respective chambers. So there's a lot of some of the more consequential bills that have not made it to the governor's desk yet, and those will come later in the session. Going into this session, we identified 8 priority areas, ranging from Medicaid expansion access as our #1 priority, all the way down to energy and workforce development, entrepreneurship. And so those are kind of the range of the priority areas that we took focus on. During this first half of this legislative session, the Montana Chamber went in and supported 62 bills, and we opposed 41. I'll note here on these 62 and 41 numbers is that there's some of those bills, as we navigate a legislative session, there's some relationship management that comes in both of those bills, right? Sometimes we'll get contacted by one of our good partners in a different association or a lobbyist, and they ask us to come in and support a bill. And so we'll first determine if it's something that fits within our view shed of priorities and what matters to us as a business community. And then we'll evaluate whether or not going in on this bill, either in opposition or in support of it, helps us maintain that relationship. And so we do a lot of relationship management through the bills that we support and oppose. In particular, the big challenge comes with those bills that we oppose, because we're having to make decisions on bills that matter to us, and whether we don't, both whether we support it or whether we oppose it. But then you also have legislators that are also very wedded to their concept. And so going in and opposing a bill that a legislator has brought forward, right, comes with some very sensitive sort of conversations and some real deep consideration, because every legislator, regardless of whether you think their idea is a terrible idea or a horrible idea, they are very wedded to their idea. And so you need to navigate that relationship very carefully when we go into oppose a bill. And one of the practices that we have is we notify all the legislators before we go in and oppose their bill and tell them, we're going to have to oppose your bill. We don't like opposing your bill. We're going to have to oppose your bill. Here's the reasons why. Charles in particular does a great job of trying to see if there are fixes that can be made to a legislator's bill that we oppose to take us from opposition to neutral to maybe even support. And that is, I would argue, a step above and beyond what most other individuals will do through this legislative process. Most of them will make the decision, we're just going to oppose your bill and we'll let the chips fall where they may. Charles does an outstanding job of trying to maintain those relationships by seeing if there are places that we can fix a bill to take us at a minimum into a neutral position. And so, we're very respectful, very mindful of this reputation that we have built as an organization, a reputation that predates Charles and Todd and Sheridan's presence here. We're tracking over 177 bills. And so there's a lot of bills. That's a lot of words to look at. It's a lot of legal words to look at, which is, a real heavy lift that we're compressing into a very short period of time. So that's a kind of a thumbnail, high-level wrap of the first 45 days, where things stand at this 45-day mark. The legislature comes back in on Friday, they gavel in, but they won't really start diving into much work until the first of next week.
Indeed.
And I think go ahead, Sheridan.
On those supports and opposes, as especially Charles is putting in the work for amendments, we might change our position and just making note of that, right? As these numbers might change by the time you see this slide next.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good point. What's the next slide, Sheridan?
You've got your priorities here.
Oh, yeah. So I'll tackle this one here. As you all know, Medicaid access, the expansion component of that, went in as our #1 priority. We maintain that the federal government's support of Medicaid expansion with a 90% cost share here in the state of Montana is important to the business community in whole, not just to the hospitals that are receiving those Medicaid payments, but also to the business community as a whole, because we are facing a massive workforce shortage, and having every able-bodied individual healthy and able to show up to work is crucial to us. And so Medicaid access was the #1 priority for us as we went into this legislative session. And I'll be honest, we thought this was going to be a much bigger dust-up, a much more contentious issue than it was. It ended up kind of, I think, quite frankly, the vote outcome in both the House and the Senate was exactly as we kind of had predicted, or we had people predicting for us. And the consternation and some of the hot political rhetoric didn't follow Medicaid access. And so that bill has passed the Senate and the House.
That had a lot to do. I think, with the fact that the business community and the more, there was a large group of right of center advocates that were supporting the bill. And if it had been, left to if it had been left to the loudest voices, I don't think the bill would have passed.
Yeah.
And it was a very broad coalition, and there was a significant segment, like I say, center-right voices that I think helped keep this thing on the rails and ensure that it wasn't a trench warfare.
Yeah, that's a great point. So it's moved. It's passed both chambers, and it has yet to be transferred, last I knew, to the governor's desk for signage. But it has passed the 2 big significant votes that we were expecting there. The next one is going to be I think this is going to be the issue that is going to define the remainder of this legislative session. That's going to be tax reform. There is a big divide over what to do with regard to tax reform. There's the governor's property tax reform proposal in House Bill 231. There's another property tax proposal that's being carried by a Democrat. And then there's a Senate Bill 90, which takes the portion of the lodging and rental car taxes that are currently going just into the general fund and tags that specifically to property tax relief. Senate Bill 90, as it stands today, probably doesn't provide much real property tax relief because there's not enough dollars generated from lodging and rental car taxes to make substantial property tax relief. But it is a vehicle that additional pieces could be added to that would provide some property tax relief. The governor's proposal, House Bill 231, right, is in for some interesting times now that it has passed the House and it is over on the Senate. There's some real differences of opinions on what to do with the property tax proposal the governor has offered up. The governor's proposal essentially bifurcates both homes and businesses in the state of Montana and bifurcates them into, the best way to put it, large and other. So if you are a large property taxpayer on the business side of things, the proposal essentially increases property tax on the larger property taxpayers on the business side. Same way on the homeowner side of things is that more expensive homes, secondary homes, those sort of folks are going to see a property tax increase in order to provide a property tax reduction for the folks that fit in the other category. What we see here on this here is something that we're talking more and more about at the chamber, is that given Montana's current tax structure, the only way that we're going to be able to provide meaningful property tax relief is we're going to have to increase property tax on other property taxpayers. And that's the system that we've got, which is primarily a property tax and income tax as far as significant revenue generated to the state of Montana, with the third leg being somewhat of a natural resource sort of taxes. And we know that that leg is getting a little bit shorter. At some point, I'm starting to make this pitch more and more as I talk to groups around the state. At some point, I'm hoping that we're getting closer to that point. We're going to have a more meaningful conversation about what tax reform looks like in the state. Because until we do, given the tax system that we have today, we are only shifting costs amongst different property taxpayers. The third component here is tax increment finance districts. This probably fits a little bit kind of like Medicaid access in the sense that we're expecting a lot bigger sort of dust up when it comes to tax increment finance districts, which is really important not only to local governments, but to the development community, right? As developers look to invest in those areas of communities that are blighted or have fallen in disrepair. And so largely, I would say that we are in much better shape than we expected we would be at this point. We went into this thing kind of preparing for a battle, and it's not really come to fruition. We've got a bit of a bill that we're trying to sort out the role that we will play in the second half of the legislative session, and that's Senate Bill 2, which changes how newly taxable is treated within these TIF districts once a TIF district expires. And so a TIF district will be created, and the end of that TIF district in 20 years or 30 years or whatever, all those, once bonding and all the different components are finished up and a TIF district no longer exists, there is a dispute about how you tax the improvements that were made in that TIF district over the last 20 or 30 years. And so we're evaluating that and seeing if we're going to need to play a role in that on the second half of the legislative session. So there's a fair amount of detail in those three things there, but those were some of the some of the bigger sort of priorities that we had going in. And I think the next slide talks about yeah, this is a Charles Robison area, right? He's got the fun stuff of energy, environment, and legal reform. So I'll give it to you, Charles.
All right, thanks, Todd. So the work in with the Montana Environmental Policy Act was precipitated by the Supreme Court's decision in the Held case. which was a group of was fronted by a group of Montana kids. It's a national movement led by large environmental groups to line up young people to file suit, saying their state doesn't have adequate environmental regulations to prevent climate change. And to boil it down, the Supreme Court said the state needs to conduct a greenhouse gas assessment in the Montana Environmental Policy Act process, which is a just a procedural process where the state evaluates the consequences or the outcomes of state actions. And state actions include issuing permits for everything from building new trails to authorizing gravel pits, expanding electrical generation facilities, and you name it. So this boils down to the legislature came back and the chamber worked hand in hand with senior legislative leaders to help get stakeholder input on the list of bills, the list of House bills you see there, along with Senate Bill 221. And collectively, these bills both reaffirm that MEPA is procedural. It doesn't create independent regulatory authority, and also, especially in Senate Bill 221, create a framework for conducting greenhouse gas assessments. And so with the chamber gathered a lot of stakeholder input on these bills, helped fine tune them. Our lobbying team at Barnett and Calzak, Berry and Hovind was very involved in that process. And these bills are moving forward, and looks like we'll be in a place to see some significant progress of both meeting the requirements of the Supreme Court, but also giving business a stable and predictable framework for reporting greenhouse gases and not setting sort of maximum limits on those that would get in the way of economic development. So we played a big role there, and that was a pretty aggressive tussle with a lot of groups that traditionally oppose natural resource development and like to use the pre-existing framework to file lawsuits and shut down projects. And we think when these bills take effect, that we'll see fewer successful lawsuits and more projects approved in a more streamlined fashion. Then we have also tackled overall legal reform in parallel with the environmental legal reforms. And House Bill 195, one of the first out of the gate, the chamber was a very aggressive partner with the Montana Medical Association and the medical community to increase the current caps on non-economic damages. And basically, there's been for a number of years, there's been a cap of $250,000 on non-economic damages, which is not your medical bills, it's other damages you suffer, pain and suffering, basically, in medical malpractice. And the concern is that because that cap has been fixed for a long time, that it could face constitutional challenge. And so the chamber played a strong supporting role with the Medical Association in raising that cap. And in that sense, doctors and hospitals were increasing their own insurance premiums and increasing the amounts that patients will be able to recover in a successful suit, because both to provide compensation to patients and also preserve the constitutionality of those caps, which, if they were taken away entirely, would greatly increase the cost of medical malpractice insurance. And then we have a group of three, House Bill 301, House Bill 791, House Bill 803, that'll rein in some of the practices of trial lawyers, abuses of both Montana laws and some trends we're seeing across the country, where the plaintiff's bar has been really aggressively expanding the definition of certain tort claims, and in other cases playing kind of a hide the ball, where preventing juries from seeing all the evidence to make a thoughtful decision in a case. And those three bills that passed the House, we're working with both other supporters as well as some of the opponents to move these moving these forward in the Senate, and listening to feedback from legislators and from some of the bill opponents. There's a few places we might be considering some amendments on those, and so we're working those bills right now. And then Senate Bill 511 passed, I think, unanimously in the Senate. It was a bill to prohibit foreign adversaries from lawsuit investing. It's called third-party litigation financing, and that bill came unanimously out of committee. It did really well on the floor of the Senate, and now we're getting ready to move it in the House.
And if there's if anybody wants more details on those very nuanced legal reform bills, we have some nice little handouts that explain them a bit.
Yeah.
If you're interested.
And I'll just point out here real quick while we take a pause here before we get into Sheridan. Sheridan's going to have an example of it as well. As we were talking about this earlier this morning, is that the Montana Chamber is a pretty bipartisan or nonpartisan sort of an organization. A lot of these bills that we're working on, at times, depending on the issue area, require largely a Republican sort of majority, and hoping we can pull a Democrat or two. And then at other times, we're depending upon Democrats and pulling a few Republicans. And so we are aggressively working across the aisle, depending on the issue area. And so these are a couple of examples here, which we tend to look at Republicans to be largely supportive of these sort of these ideas and this philosophy as we go forward. Some of the issues that I've referenced before, we tend to look at Democrats to be largely supportive of, and trying to pull a few Republicans. And so maintaining these relationships that we have in both political parties is really important to us, because as the legislative session rolls along, we need both Republicans and Democrats depending upon the issue. And so we protect those relationships we have very closely. So with that, Sheridan, you want to kind of
and
stop here?
As we move on, I think that there's also that argument when it comes to our partners in building coalitions in the advocacy community, because I think that there's an argument that the Montana Chamber could be involved in pretty much everything. You could tie pretty much everything that happens in that building back to business in some way. And so we are supportive where we can be, and stay in the background on other bills and stay out of other bills, both from a relationship perspective and maintaining our political capital as the Montana Chamber. Moving into the policy areas I get to work in most, childcare, our big push this session is Senate Bill 321. It's been introduced but has not yet been heard in committee because it is a revenue bill as a tax credit package. Senator Kastmeyer is carrying it, and that would create a tax credit for parents who have a child under the age of 5, as well as a tax credit for those who work in childcare, because it's such a high turnover, low wage industry. And those folks that care for our kids in childcare are the backbone of that industry, as well as where we come in, a $5,000 refundable, all of these tax credits are refundable, but refundable tax credit for employers that are helping with dependent care in some way. So we see childcare as an industry that is really affecting our workforce, and it needs a little bit of a boost in some way, not necessarily a forever government subsidy, but at least some sort of change or some sort of help from the government angle to get it back on its feet again, and employers, incentivizing employers and the private sector to do their part in that with a tax credit like this. Also looking at a childcare trust fund and perhaps another sort of infrastructure bill, things that support capacity. The trust fund would be a separate pot of money in the general fund that would go towards capacity improvements or quality improvements in child cares, and that would be administered through a departmental agency, and again, doing what we can to improve that. And then if that has that separate pot of money, then in 10 years, when childcare looks a little bit different or the challenges might look a little different, that money is already allocated to help address those changes. We'll see what happens there. That has not yet been heard either. It's a revenue bill, and so it's not yet introduced even, which is why there's not a bill number up there. So moving right along, we've supported a couple other subsidy changes and supports that would help childcare workers be eligible for subsidy, or changing the eligibility for childcare subsidy to instead of a percentage of the federal poverty level, which it currently, if you make 185% or less of the federal poverty level, you would qualify for some level of childcare subsidy. It's a big, complicated grid based on how many people you have in your family and how much money you make and what you would pay for childcare. But at the end of the day, this bill would change that to state median income rather than federal poverty level. So it's a little bit more Montana specific, especially when we look at those high cost of living areas. And then with that, in order to receive that subsidy, which a lot of our low wage workers do, you have to be a licensed childcare facility. And there were a couple of bills that would have changed how licensure works pretty fundamentally. In the interim, for the last 5 years, there's been work through the department on changing the rule package. So there's regulations in statute, and then most of the regulations live in rule of departments, and that makes it a little bit more flexible in order for the department to offer waivers. But if it's in statute, then pretty much everything is equal across the board. And basically, those changes would have jeopardized that $41 million that we receive in federal funding that would go towards childcare. And we didn't want to do that, so we did oppose and defeat those bills last week. And we appreciate the care in that, but again, one of those political games that we're playing. In the workforce arena, we have been able to support bills that increase funding for middle school career and technical education, or you get workforce credits or school credits if you volunteer in long-term care, child care settings, or another one that I can't quite remember now, as well as some changes to work comp that ensures you can get back to work as soon as possible, and some other things in that regard. And then housing, we know, is still an important issue, but there's been a lot less movement than we expected in the housing arena. From the chamber perspective, we really focus on the supply side of that equation and what we can do to make it easier to build. And there's been some zoning changes, and we've kind of followed the lead of some of our local government friends on how that would impact the Montana Land Use Planning Act. I don't fully understand all of those things, but we did support a bill that would give some funding to the workforce housing fund. Todd, anything to add there on housing front with your experience on the task force?
I would just say that in the 2023 session, there was a lot of changes made with regard to zoning and housing and where you could build houses and multifamily houses. A lot of those sort of changes were passed in the 2023 legislative session. Local government essentially encouraged us between 23 and 2025 to take a breath, let them have a chance to implement some of the laws, develop rules around the laws on a local level. And so I don't think anyone should be concerned about the fact that there haven't been big movements. In fact, it may be better as local governments work to implement some of the big changes that happened in 2023. As Sheridan noticed, there was a couple of bills related to housing and funding, particularly as it relates to infrastructure that we went in and supported. That remains to be one of the big things that we hear is development of greenfield areas and not having dollars for infrastructure to connect into existing infrastructure there. And so that would be the big thing there. I'll just point out too, as we wrap up this childcare, workforce, and housing slide here is that particularly on childcare and to a large extent on workforce, this is an issue area that is new to the Montana Chamber because we just didn't have the personnel to dive into these issues. And Sheridan has taken a big lead, particularly on childcare. She is now a real expert in this arena, and we're no longer a two-bit player in this discussion. We're actually a leader in this discussion, and that's thanks to the work that Sheridan has done there. Childcare fits firmly underneath that workforce pillar, which is part of our strategic plan. We regularly hear from businesses that like we can't find a reliable workforce because there's childcare gaps. There are affordable housing sort of challenges. And then there's also the piece that we hear a lot of, which is related to new employees not being ready for the job space that they were just hired for. And so when you see terms like career and technical education under workforce and the fact that we're engaging in some of that, it's in fact due to the fact that we're trying to support efforts that give kids more career awareness at a younger age and provide some of those skills for students, whether they go into college or whether they go straight into the workforce. And so we're seeing that there's a real need, there's a real demand, and we've got a lot of support too amongst the legislative body for seeing some of those sort of career and technical education support bills that we see moving through the legislative session. And so Sheridan's taken a lead on that as well because she's a former FFA state FFA president, and she understands and is living proof of the value of career and technical education. So thank you, Sheridan, for the great work you do on childcare and workforce. It's really expanded our presence in this legislative session, and as noted, it's like it's taken us from being someone that kind of comes in as a me too, and instead we're now a leader in this sort of arena. So with that, I think we got one more slide.
Indeed. It does say looking ahead to the next 45 days as they change the transmittal calendar. I think there's only about 43 days left. They shifted things around a little bit to give themselves, I think, a little bit longer of a break. As you can see, we're all sitting in our own homes, enjoying the break from being in the halls of the Capitol. As Charles mentioned, our big bills have made it through Transmittal and will be seen on the other side, on the other house, and some other bills still have revenue attached to them, so we're still working those. As Todd mentioned, revenue bills can be introduced for another 2 weeks or so, and we'll see how that works out. And keeping our eye on all of those things that could be pertinent, right? And then just kind of playing the political game, as some folks might have so as an explainer, folks can introduce a bill or request a bill with a specific title, and so we call those just titles that are hanging out there that somebody could snag and amend and introduce before March 22nd that might pop up that we don't even know about but could really wreak havoc or be very supportive of something that we are working on. And then how some of the politics amongst the branches and amongst the houses and amongst the parties or within the parties might affect specific votes or things on that front. And as we look at all of these things, if there's a particular bill or bills that you're really concerned about and you can't figure out exactly how the new legislative website works, or if you just want an inside take on what we might have heard, please feel free to reach out at any point or ask how we might be able to help with that, whether we can make any moves as part on behalf of the chamber, or if it's just some advice that we can give you as we walk the halls each day. Anything else to add? Todd, Charles?
This was a bit of a longer brief than we normally do, just because I think it's important at the halfway point that we reflect back on the ground that we've plowed. And there's a lot yet to come with about 45 days. A lot of deals start to get cut. I don't mean that in a negative manner. It's part of the process, and people start trying to figure out how they can advance, their priority, and they start working with others. And so there's a lot that's going to happen over the course of the next 45 days. We're going to be in the middle of it. I tell folks when they ask me, how I feel about where we sit as an organization with regard to this legislative session. I said, on issues that matter on issues that matter to us, I think we're exactly where we want to be, right? The things that matter to us are exactly where they want to be. Those issues that, for the most part, that we wanted to see put to bed and killed in committee or on the House floor largely have been. The ones that we wanted to pass largely have passed. And so I think as we start the next 45 days, feel like we're in a pretty good position because of the groundwork that we've laid in the first 45 days. And then I'll see if Charles has anything to add to this. But first, I want to point out that on Monday, and this is not directly related to this, but this may be of interest to some of you that are on this call. On Monday at 11 a.m., we have the U.S. Chamber coming in to do about a half-an-hour briefing on trade and tariffs to members only. And so we sent out an email here earlier this morning announcing that if you want to participate in that, register for that. So we've got one of the experts at the U.S. Chamber going to give us a little bit of insight on how trade matters to the United States as a whole and what some of this tariff activity means or could mean in this new world that we're living in. So just wanted to bring that to your attention. So make sure you pay attention to that email that went out earlier this morning if that's an issue that matters to you.